Hello and welcome to this February 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest in this edition of the programme is Michael Klare, who's written about the US's assassination of Iran's General Soleimani in the February edition of the paper. On the 3rd of January this year, a US drone strike on Baghdad International Airport targeted and killed this top-ranking figure in the Iranian regime. The order came from President Trump, but who and what influenced his decision? And how does it fit within the US's broader geostrategic aims? What does it say about the Trump administration's priorities and their worldview? Michael Klare is Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. When I spoke to him earlier this month, I began by asking him to give me a sense of how significant a target General Soleimani had been for the US.
General Soleimani was a very senior official in the Iranian government. He was deeply revered by the Iranian people, and he had a very senior position. He was like the equivalent in the United States as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and a very senior military official at the same time. And he was responsible really for managing Iran's foreign policy in large parts of the Middle East. So indeed, he was a very senior official.
And the official justification that was given by the US administration in the aftermath of the assassination was that Soleimani had been involved in planning imminent attacks. And that doesn't really hold water, you think?
No, this was the reason given at the time, that he was planning imminent attacks, and I underscore that word imminent, on U.S. embassies and military installations around the Middle East. And no evidence has ever been produced to verify that claim. And before long, the White House gave up trying to justify that claim, and they don't say that anymore. Now they have all kinds of other reasons that they give, that, for example, this was a deterrent to the Iranian officials, that we want to show you that if they continue to threaten U.S. interests in the Middle East, the U.S. has the capacity to strike back with violence, with extreme violence. That's the current explanation.
And then some commentators preferred a more psychological explanation and saw it as, part of Trump's desire to show his strength and not to show any sign of weakness. But again, that's not a sufficient explanation.
No. There was some talk that President Trump had been inadequately tough in responding to Iranian provocations in the Persian Gulf area, particularly after Iran is said to have attacked Saudi oil facilities last fall, and also, other provocations against oil tankers and the like in the Persian Gulf, that he did not respond forcefully enough. So some argument being made that he felt he had to show that he could be a tough guy. I don't believe that either. Nobody is talking that way anymore anyway.
So the ultimate decision would, of course, rest with the president. But the people who would be privy to that ultimate decision, would that be a very small coterie?
Yes, indeed. Obviously, this is a decision made in the White House by the president himself and his close advisors. And it was a small group, including, most importantly, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the Vice President, Mike Pence, and a few other close advisors. Noticeably missing from this decision-making process, I think, is Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense. It seems like the Defense Department was sort of sidelined in this process. But there are other figures who I think played a role leading up to the decision, like Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and key advisor on the Middle East, and other figures who weigh in the president's small circle of advisors, some of them in government and some of them outside of government.
Those three men that you've just mentioned, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and Jared Kushner, all of them you place in the camp of the ideologues, and your article writes about those ideologues within the administration being in conflict or tension with the geopoliticians. And I wanted to talk about each of those camps in turn. Now, the ideologues, they're the people who really have their sights set on Iran.
Yes, this camp of people I call the ideologues have deep roots in Washington. These are people who have viewed Iran in the crosshairs for a very long time, who think that Iran is the center of evil in some respects. You could think back to President Bush, the first and second President Bush, both of whom have had strong views on Iran, the axis of evil, and then during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there were many in Washington who said that that's just the beginning, that the real enemy is Tehran, that we have to go from Iraq to Iran and to transform the Middle East and eliminate the Iranian threat. And this group continues to have a lot of influence in Washington. And as I argue, I call them ideologues because they're driven by hatred of Iran and Islam more than any consideration of Iran's actual power in the world, global geopolitical sweepstakes, as it were. Clearly, Iran does not have the kind of capabilities that, say, Russia has, let alone China or even India or Pakistan, which is nuclear armed. Iran has none of those capabilities. But from the perspective of the ideologues, it holds central place in their view of threats to the United States.
Yes, I mean, to the extent, as you quote in your article, to the extent that Vice President Pence described what he saw as Iran's ambitions to revive a greater Persian empire.
Yes, this is a comment that Mike Pence made in a speech last year in Warsaw, Poland, at a conference on the Middle East, where he said that the Iranians' ultimate goal is to reconstitute the Persian Empire of the past and to dominate the entire Middle East. And this is a preposterous notion that we have to fear this kind of a threat. But it's characteristic of this ideological camp to over-exaggerate the threat posed by Iran.
So in the other camp, the camp which is in tension with these ideologues, is the group which you call the geopoliticians. And I guess I was thinking, well, would it be fair to think of another name for them as being the pragmatists?
Yes, these are people who think in classical great power terms, who see the world as a giant chessboard with powerful players fighting, contending with one another for territory on the global chessboard. And from this perspective, the powerful players today are Russia, China, and the United States, maybe India to some degree, and that the future of American power rests on its ability to overpower those other players, especially China, but also Russia, and that everything must be focused on building America's capacity to hem in, to contain the rise of China and the rise of Russia. And everything else is secondary to that. Now, this is the official national strategy of the United States, according to the Department of Defense. The national defense strategy is to devote everything to prepare for conflict with other great powers, namely Russia and China. This is a very different perspective from that of the ideologues.
So you'd find particular support for this view in the Pentagon and the intelligence community. Is that kind of where its power base lies?
Yes, indeed. It's mainly in the Defense Department and to some degree the intelligence community. The Defense Department, if you read their budget statements, what do they want to spend money on? What are they asking Congress for money for? It's to build up high technology weaponry to defeat China in a future war. Super sophisticated missiles, aircraft, tanks, and warships. That's what they say is the current struggle in the world stage. That's what's important to them. But there are other figures in this, elites in Washington, in the Treasury Department, for example, in the business community, who see China as the great threat to the future, to America's global economic dominance, who also want to hem in China. So there's a coalition there in this geopolitical camp.
And as you say, the ideologues date back at least as far as the Bush administrations. Is there something different about the nature of the tension between the two camps under Trump, would you say?
Well, Donald Trump has ties to both camps, obviously. Many of his economic advisors, like Steve Mnuchin, his lead economic advisor, is very strongly in the anti-China camp. He's doing everything he can to curtail China's growth. So he has that wing, but he's also strongly influenced, and I argue in my article that the attack on Soleimani reflects this. He's very powerfully influenced by the ideological camp, and this reflects the strong influence of Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, the Secretary of State and the Vice President, but also Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who plays a very outsized role in the White House. And Jared Kushner, we know, has very close ties to key figures in the Middle East, to Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, whose whole identity as leader of Israel, and he's now running again for re-election, rests on his ability to contest Iran, to fight Iran. That is who Netanyahu is. Also, the leader, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, another key influencer in Washington via Jared Kushner, who also seeks to block the Iranians. So you have these outside influences in the White House via Jared Kushner and others.
So should we see the assassination of Soleimani as a demonstration that the ideologues are in the ascendant, or is that too sweeping a judgment to make on the strength of this of this one act?
Well, I would argue, and this is what I try to say in my article, that there's a pendulum, and these forces swing back and forth at any given time. One is going to have more influence. I argue, and I believe, that the assassination of Soleimani reflects the ascendancy at this moment of the ideological camp, but it could shift back at any time in the other direction. Right now, with China hobbled by the coronavirus disease, I think the imminence of the China threat might have receded, whereas the Iranian threat may appear to be more pronounced for the moment. But I think that will change. And for example, right now, the budget, this is the time of year when the Defense Department presents its budget request to Congress, and it's all China, 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 and a little bit about Russia, Russia. There's no mention of Iran in there as a threat. So you will hear a lot of language in the coming months about the China threat.
But was the assassination of Soleimani intended in some way to redress that, to sort of shift the pendulum, if you like, by provoking a reaction from Iran, which would then warrant a counter-reaction from the United States, part of which would be a greater deployment of resources and forces in order to counter Iran?
This, I believe, is part of what went on. Yes, I think that by killing Soleimani and provoking a harsh Iranian reaction, which turned out to be less harsh, I think, than everybody assumed would be the case, that this would justify a further buildup of American forces and very possibly a war with Iran, or at least severe attacks on Iran. You'll recall that John Bolton, the former national security advisor, who's very much in the news today because of his comments about what Trump said about the Ukraine military aid, situation. But John Bolton tweeted when all this occurred, let regime change begin. Those were his words. I think this was the hope of the ideological camp, that there would be a spiral of violence leading to war with Iran. Now, let me say right now that moment has not passed entirely. What's happening now is a major buildup of American military forces in the Middle East. It may be that we didn't go to war at that moment because the U.S. was not ready for war. It didn't have the capacities in place. And even though the mass media has turned their attention away from Iran as things appear to have quieted down, in fact, the Pentagon is deploying more forces in the Middle East every day. It's actually accelerating the buildup. And the Central Command, the U.S. military is divided up into these regional commands, the Pacific Command, the European Command, the Africa Command. And the Middle East is governed in the military by the Central Command. The Central Command has said that we're preparing for war in the Middle East and we're planning to stay there for a long time to come. So it's very possible that a future spark, another kind of spark, could occur at any time. The U.S. now has in place, which it didn't have a month or so ago, much larger forces.
And if the ideologues' main focus of attention was Iran, how do you imagine they were viewing the repercussions in Iraq, which was where the assassination was carried out? Would they be figuring that in their calculations?
It's hard to see how they could have included that in their calculations, because, as we know, it's produced a very sharp backlash in Iraq, with the parliament calling for the U.S. to withdraw its forces entirely. And a lot of the militias, which have ties to Iran, staging demonstrations and rallies calling for a U.S. withdrawal. I think it's very complicated. I read yesterday in one of these military journals that doesn't make it into the mass media that the U.S. was going to move a Patriot anti-missile battery to Iraq to help defend U.S. troops there, and a decision was made to postpone that because of the uncertainty regarding the situation in Iraq. So I doubt very much that the ideologues thought about this when they took this decision.
You mentioned, Michael, the budgeting that's going on at the moment, and it's always very interesting to look at that to see where the money is actually being spent. Let me ask you finally, what else are you looking at? What else are you monitoring in order to assess how things are likely to develop as regards the US's policy on the Middle East?
When you look at the defense budget, the Middle East does not figure very prominently in the planning for the future budget, which would be for fiscal year 2021. As I say, all the emphasis is on China, 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 then Russia, and maybe North Korea. However, what's very interesting about the U.S. military, and I think overseas audiences may not be so familiar with this, is what's called inter-service rivalry. That is to say, the competition between the different services for a share of the money. Right now, it's the Navy is asked for a larger chunk of the money than everybody else, than the Army and the Air Force, because they say the big threat is China, and that's going to be a naval war occurring in the Pacific. They need more ships, so they need a bigger share of the budget. But the other services are saying, well, no, we have other fights. We have a war in Europe that may occur, and we need more army troops and more tanks and the like. And some of that bears on the Middle East, that we have to be prepared to fight what they would call a mid-intensity war, not counterinsurgency, which are low-intensity war, or a high-intensity war with Russia, but a middle-intensity war with Iran, we need funds for that as well. So there's jostling going on between the services, and not only between the services, but between these different commands. The European Command wants more money to fight Russia. The Pacific Command wants more money to fight China. And the Central Command is making a big push now to fight Iran. This is going to be a very interesting political battle because not everybody is going to get all they want, and they're all contending with one another for a bigger share of the budget. For the European Command, they're going to make their big push starting next month with what's called Exercise Defender, which is the biggest U.S. NATO exercise in Europe since the end of the Cold War. They're planning to go back to World War II and Cold War-like scenarios of a massive land war in Europe, something that nobody has thought about, in 25, 30 years. But you folks should be on the lookout for a replay of those massive tank battles and the like in Europe. The U.S. is very seriously thinking about what they call great power conflict, massive wars of a kind we haven't seen before that are very likely to escalate into nuclear war.
I was talking to Michael Klare about his article, Washington's Strategic Split on Iran, which is in the February 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. Michael's most recent book, published last year, is All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Michael's article is also available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.